on world affairs. I'm Dr. Greg Young. I'm a dual appointment in the Department of Political Science and the International Affairs program here at CU. I mostly teach on terrorism and Middle East politics, but today, luckily, you don't have to listen to me because we have a very distinguished panel of people who are experts in the region or about the issue. What I'd like to do is introduce them briefly. I know you all have programs in front of you that has a much more detailed biography, but let me just give you a couple of highlights. And we're going to start from my left, immediate left, and move further that way. And they're each going to speak for 10 minutes, have 5 or so minutes to add additional comments and rebuttal, and then I'd like to open it up to all of you for your questions, not statements. I used to bring a boat horn when I did this, and if it went into a 1-minute statement, I'd set off the boat horn, but I woke up children in the front row and they got mad at me. So I can't do that anymore. To my immediate left, we have Mr. Mark Fallon, who is the director of Club Fed, a security consulting company on international security matters, formerly of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the Navy Criminal Investigative Service, not the one on TV, the real one. And he was involved in some of the most significant counterterrorism operations in U.S. history, including the investigation of the bombing of the USS Cole. To his left is Ms. Malou Innocent, a former adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, now a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Her research areas are the Middle East and U.S. global security and U.S. foreign policy. She is the author of Perilous Partners, the Benefits and Pitfalls of American Alliances with Authoritarian Regimes. There you go. Shameless plugs are always welcome. She has previously been a guest analyst on CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera. To her left is Ms. Joanne Grady Huskey, international educator, co-founder and vice president of Live to Lead, Young Women's International Leadership. She also has a career as a family member of the Foreign Service Officer and has a recent memoir called The Unofficial Diplomat about her travels around the world. And finally, but not least, Ms. Anna Therese Day, an award-winning independent journalist and social media researcher. Her coverage focuses on American foreign policy and women's issues. She is a 2013 Fulbright Fellow and a United Nations Press Fellow. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Mark Fallon, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. For those of you expecting Mark Harmon, I apologize. Sorry to disappoint you. I want to talk a little bit about the emergence of the group that, at least by the title here, we're calling ISIS, the Islamic State we're calling it ISIS of Iraq and Syria. It's called ISIL, the Islamic State of the Islamic Levant. And I prefer to call it Daesh. I believe they're a Daeshi cult. Daesh is a pejorative term in the Middle East that means those that would sow the seeds of discord. We may get to that later, but let me talk about how this group has emerged. I started working Al-Qaeda before I knew it was called Al-Qaeda. Back in the early 90s, when I was an NCIS agent, we were working a counterintelligence asset that happened to penetrate a ring in New York City that had intended to blow up the United Nations, the federal building, the Holland and Lincoln tunnels, and various landmarks. And we worked a case on a guy called the Blind Sheikh, Omar Akhdal Rahman. And this is even before the first World Trade Center attack. The first Trade Center was attacked the first time, and we interdicted that terrorist cell. One of the members was somebody named Ramzi Youssef, who was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed's nephew. And so out of this group, Rahman was with the Egyptian Islamic Jihad. We started to learn about a group that was emerging that was called Al-Qaeda. Fast forward, when I was introduced, it was mentioned that I worked at the USS Cole investigation. I was the commander of that task force for NCIS, and we were on the trail of Al-Qaeda, who attacked us on the 12th of October 2000, and we lost 17 sailors that day who died heroes at 11:14 in the afternoon on the 12th of October in Aden, Yemen. As we were on the trail of those terrorists on September 11th, as I stood in a hotel room in London, England, on the way to the NATO Defense Ministers Conference to alert the NATO Defense Ministers of the gravity of the terrorist threat, of the threat of Al-Qaeda, while I was looking outward, we were attacked in the rear, and Al-Qaeda attacked us, and 3,000 people gave their lives on September 11th, 2001. We started working on those investigations, and President Bush established a task force and gave the Department of Defense the authority to investigate the Al-Qaeda terrorist network, and I became the special agent in charge of that task force. So while the CIA was responsible for collecting intelligence from Al-Qaeda, it was my responsibility with an order from the President to bring terrorists to justice. As we created a task force and were hunting terrorists around the world, I had established our headquarters at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. We had forward deployed units in Afghanistan and at Guantanamo Bay, and the war drums started to beat for Iraq. At the time, I had worked Al-Qaeda for a number of years, and when I heard within the Department of Defense that there was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, I challenged that notion. It did not make sense to me from the way I had worked Al-Qaeda. We had no intelligence or information that there was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, yet there were people that were convinced that there were Al-Qaeda in Iraq. President Bush went to Cincinnati, Ohio, and gave a speech and said there was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and Colin Powell later went before the United Nations and also said there was a unique source and there was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Some of the information they used came from a guy named Ibn Sheikh al-Libi, the emir of the Khaldun training camp in Afghanistan, who initially was in custody in the U.S. in Bagram, and who I was intending to bring to trial before military commissions, but the CIA ghosted him and brought him to another service, and Ibn Sheikh al-Libi had said there is Al-Qaeda in Iraq. When it was over, he later recanted that and said, I just said that so the pain would stop. So part of what led us to war was false and fabricated information that was the result of torture. So we invaded Iraq, and we went in, and there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. There was no high-level interactions between Saddam Hussein and Iraq. It just didn't make any sense at the time. And there really was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But Al-Qaeda in Iraq was created after that. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq became a formidable adversary. A Jordanian named Zawahiri, Zarqawi, went in and was beheading people. And he was target number one for the Department of Defense for a number of years, and we were on his trail. Zarqawi, his demise came, and I think strategically, when he planted a bomb in Jordan, he got a lot of people upset, and we had a lot more information, and Zarqawi met his demise as well. Well, that group has later emerged, and the United States did what was called de-Baathification. So when we invaded Iraq, we took the existing people in power, and we disaffected them. We eliminated them. We moved them out of any positions of power, and we started to create an adversary that later would hate us. We had people in prison. We had a prison in Camp Bucca in Iraq, and the current leader of ISIL, this Daeshi cult, a guy named Baghdadi, actually was a prisoner in U.S. custody in Camp Bucca. I'm still waiting to read the reports about how he might have been treated when he was in our custody. So from this group, we now had Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and that group has now emerged and rebranded itself as this Daeshi cult when they proclaimed that it was a caliphate. And that proclamation was actually opposed by Al-Qaeda. They are actually too radical for Al-Qaeda and Zawahiri. And one of the adversaries of this Daeshi cult in Iraq and Syria is actually a group called al-Nusra. And so we might think that that's a good thing that we have other Muslims, the al-Nusra, fighting with this group, this Daeshi cult, but that is actually an al-Qaeda affiliated group. So you actually have violent extremists who are vented on our destruction, fighting other terrorists who have the same goals in mind. So I'll just end my presentation there with just trying to set a foundation for how this group was created and the very adversary that we're now fighting. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you to my fellow co-panelists. The title of this panel is The Threat of ISIS, and my response to that would be, ISIS is a threat, but a threat compared to what? ISIS is certainly dangerous, it is certainly menacing, but in what broader context do we place the threat of ISIS? And given that broader context, what are the responsible counterterrorism policies we should adopt to respond to the threat of ISIS without exacerbating it? So in what broader context do we place the threat of ISIS? I'll begin with Europe simply because of the recent attacks in Brussels. What we see in a lot of Europe, especially Western Europe, particularly in Belgium and especially in France, which has the largest Muslim population in Europe, is a difficulty of assimilation. We've seen this time and time again of enclaves of Muslim communities that have difficulty integrating into the broader, larger society. These enclaves oftentimes have high unemployment rates, there's a level of disengagement, there's no jobs, and it instills a sense of disenfranchisement that obviously ISIS has been very effective at capitalizing on that feeling of marginalization. And this is something I can get to a little more in the Q&A, but especially with France, I think France is a particularly tough nut to crack because of the large Muslim population that exists in France. And also, it has been very forward-leaning in terms of its military aggressiveness. We've seen it act in Libya, we've seen it act in Syria, we've seen it act in Mali. In France as well, internally, as a society, it has this idea of multiculturalism, and it's a notion of not recognizing differences. Sort of we're all French. In the United States, in fact, we celebrate diversity and we recognize difference. In France, it's a little different. It's almost even more progressive in the sense that we're all French, that idea of multiculturalism. But the problem that instills is that it refuses to recognize the cleavages within society. And you see this most poignantly, certainly, with the outlaws on overt expressions of religious symbols, whether that be the crucifix or whether that be the headscarves. I know the plural of anecdote is not data, but you hear the wildest stories, especially from France, of the imposition of government-enforced secularism within France that is greatly alienating. I mean, you hear stories about Muslim girls having to shave their heads. Some of them use bandanas. There was a French politician who said that we have to have a bandana ban. There's calls to stamp out kebab stores, even though they're not North African, they're actually Turkish, but we need to have the boulangerie, we can't have these kebab stores. So there's a systematic targeting of forced secularism in many parts of Western Europe, especially in France, that further increases the sense of marginalization that ISIS is able to capitalize on. So that's one context. Another context for the threat of ISIS is al-Qaeda, which Mark has very aptly and succinctly summarized for us. The only thing I would probably expand on just a little bit is that certainly, and I think I could speak for a lot of my co-panelists, ISIS is not representative of all of Islam. In fact, you'd find many Muslims who would recoil in horror at what's being inflicted upon them in the Middle East and the broader Persian Gulf. I think what we see, however, is that ISIS explains itself within a very austere interpretation of Islam known as Salafism. And it's practiced and proselytized by our freedom-loving friends in Saudi Arabia. It's been promoted by them as not necessarily Islam in and of itself, but a form of Islamism as a form of political ideology. Of a pan-national Islamic identity, one that seeks to impose a body of law, a rule of government, and really communal and societal morality onto the rest of society. And it's these sort of 7th century legal codes that we've seen. This is why we see, the cutting off of hands, killing people in public squares, the beheading of people publicly, the crucifying of Christians, throwing homosexuals off buildings, really just the the most horrible abuses of human rights we can see is practiced by ISIS. And certainly we can see that ISIS was a spin-off of Al-Qaeda, but it's a little distinct in this respect because what Al-Qaeda, especially in the early 1990s, was focused on was the far enemy. There's actually this debate between Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, his second-in-command, about whether to go for the far enemy, the United States, or the near enemy, which were the apostate regimes that the United States supported. And so Al-Qaeda mainly focused on the United States, and this is why we saw the attack of 9/11, et cetera. But what we see with ISIS is not only are they focused on the near enemy, the apostate regimes, but they're also focused on purifying Islam. And that's why you see a lot of ISIS fighters attacking fellow Muslims, Shia, Alawites, Sufis, and they're attempting to purify their brand of Islam, and they're trying to make themselves the mainstream of Islamic identity. Another sort of context I want to place ISIS and the threat of ISIS in is within the United States. My colleagues at the Cato Institute have worked furiously on this matter in terms of understanding the threat of not only ISIS but Al-Qaeda and terrorism more broadly. Now, according to Richard Barrett, he's a former coordinator of the United Nations Al-Qaeda Taliban monitoring team. From 2007 to 2011, the chance of dying in a terrorist attack in the United States was 1 in 20 million. Now, according to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, which tracks health-related issues, you're 35,000 times more likely to die from heart disease than from a terrorist attack. You're 33,000 times more likely to die from cancer than from a terrorist attack. You're 4,000 times more likely to die from diabetes than from a terrorist attack. You're 3,000 times more likely to die from flu or pneumonia than from a terrorist attack. And you are 2,000 times more likely to die from blood poisoning than from a terrorist attack. So I think what we can gather from that is eat healthy, take care of your body. You know, in terms of threats, the call is coming from inside the house, take care of yourself. But I think it's important that we appreciate the threat of ISIS for what it is and not to allow our visceral fear of terrorism to overwhelm our sense of reason and proportionality. I'm going to sort of segue now into possible responses to counterterrorism, to the terrorist threat. And I know, that we sort of want to understand it given the broader context. But given the broader context, what are potential ways of responding to this threat, again, without exacerbating it? One, of course, is to share intelligence in order to disrupt terror cells and impede their ability to plan. Now, according to Michael Hayden, who headed both the CIA and the NSA, when you look at Europe, for instance, our European partners, they're very uneven in terms of their intelligence capabilities. He says that, and I'm sure Mark can back this up, that, you have good services in France, you have good services in Great Britain. With Germany, you find that there's a bit of reluctance, given their history of World War II, to be a little more aggressive. The Scandinavian countries are a little better. Belgium is well behind the curve, and the other countries in Europe, it's very uneven. So that's one problem. Another issue with regard to intelligence sharing is that some of the very regimes in the Middle East that we cooperate with are inadvertently suppressing jihadists, of course, but that suppression also suppresses liberal dissident voices. And that also undermines the very freedoms and the principles that we espouse across the Middle East. And so oftentimes what we find is even our alliances and our counterintelligence sharing with, say, Egypt or Jordan, that relationship can also undermine our very security by giving jihadists a justification to want to attack because of our policies. In fact, I recall a 2006 Government Accountability Office report that said, quote, U.S. foreign policy is the major root cause behind anti-American sentiments among Muslim populations, unquote. And there was a 2004 Pentagon Defense Science Board report that observed, quote, Muslims do not hate our freedom, but rather they hate our policies, unquote. So I think that is definitely important when it comes to cooperating with dictatorships and backing repressive regimes in the Middle East. Second, I would say that we must tackle the fear that terrorists seek to induce. And that really means accepting something that's very difficult, I readily admit, but we have to accept that there's no such thing as perfect security. There has to be some level of tolerable risk. And I think, for instance, what we see with the civil service and national security bureaucracies, even those that operate under a veil of classification, it's very difficult for them to not accept that threat, to accept the fact that there is no perfect security, because there are budgetary pressures, there are the push and pull of daily politics, and there are powerful political and bureaucratic incentives for politicians in Washington and those in the bureaucracies to inflate the threat, so you have a lot of threat inflation. So I think it's very difficult, but I think it's something that we must recognize as well. And also understand that there are opportunity costs to policy. So every time we say that we want to engage in counterterrorism policy, that also takes dollars away from other priorities. There are always trade-offs. You know, the NSA may want intelligence sharing and counterterrorism capabilities, but the Navy may want abilities for surveilling the Chinese Navy, for instance. So there are always competing priorities and trade-offs within defense policies, and we must recognize that as well. And lastly, I think what we must do with ISIS and the threat of ISIS is thwart its ability to attract new recruits. And this is extremely difficult, especially given the proposals that are on offer by the current crop of presidential candidates, such as those who propose torture or carpet bombing. My overarching grouse with this is that those policies, number one, are just reprehensible, but they don't address the overarching grand strategic problem of U.S. involvement in the Middle East and the broader Muslim world. What the Islamic world sees is what would be called an American obsession with the Middle East. The invasion and occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan, the drone bombings of Pakistan, Somalia, and Yemen, the constant saber rattling with Iran, this continuous drumbeat of war and imperialism that does not feed well into the narrative that we want to be on the side of the Muslim world and try and root out these extremists and jihadists. And what we've learned from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is that the enemy doesn't really exist. Especially when counterterrorism and counterinsurgency comes along, the enemy melts back into the population. It's very difficult to say who the enemy is when the enemy can melt back into the population, and that's extremely important when it comes to proposals for carpet bombing or war. And I think if we do engage in any sort of conflict with ISIS, any sort of ground campaign, we have to understand that civilians will be killed. And if you conceivably have more Muslims dying at the hands of American military, the narrative is going to be that America is killing Muslims. They're not going to hear our protests to the contrary. What they're going to see is a corpse being dragged out of a pile of rubble and that image being blasted all over Al Jazeera. And that's the reality we must face. In conclusion, I think we must understand that there is a broader conflict within Islam. Again, ISIS isn't representative of all of Islam. There is this conflict within Islam that we see with ISIS. I think also our policies can inadvertently exacerbate the problem of ISIS, so we have to be very careful. And I think we also have to recognize that in the past, our fear of terrorism has led us to adopt policies that are expensive and very, very counterproductive. We shouldn't allow the threat of ISIS and all of that to make us overreact to terrorism, because when we do that, we end up terrorizing ourselves. Thank you.
Well, I've thought a lot about this issue of the threat of ISIS, because despite what Malou just said about the odds of being a victim of terrorism, I am a victim of terrorism. Some of you may remember, in 1998 in Nairobi, Kenya, I was in the U.S. Embassy with my two little children, 5-year-old and an 8-year-old. And my husband was in the embassy. He was on the 4th floor in the ambassador's office, and I was in the basement of the embassy when Al-Qaeda blew it up. Anybody who's ever been in a terrorist incident knows that this is what hell is probably like. The confusion, the fear, the anger, the kinds of tearing apart of families that happens is unbearable. It is unbearable to watch. It's unbearable to be part of. I was able, and I'm here to talk today to you, I was able to climb out of that building with my children in tow. And my husband also, who's here today. We survived that bombing, but many of our friends did not. So I thought a lot about Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I want to distinguish the two. Al-Qaeda really had the focus of getting the US out of the Middle East. It was focused on destroying the United States. ISIS at this point still is, as Mark was talking about, much more about establishing a caliphate, a state inside the Middle East. And it is taking huge swaths of land in Syria and Iraq right now. The other thing that distinguishes Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and this is where we all come into it, is ISIS is a very, very effective media organization. They are manipulating us every day. They produce terror. Not only do they behead people, as she says, but they put it on the television, and they dress up in their orange outfits, and they have their black hoods. And we are all watching that. And they are trying to scare us. And you know what? It's starting to work. It's working. So I have thought a lot about, well, so what's the response? And that's what I would like to bring to this panel. I personally had to figure out how to respond, and I really think we all as Americans have to think, how do we respond to this? Now, of course, it is frightening, and it is horrible to watch. But the idea, as some of our presidential candidates have started to say, that we can bomb the hell out of them is a ridiculous idea. First of all, it doesn't produce anything better. We're using the same tactics that they're using. And in the end, it recruits more people who hate us because we are then perpetrating what they've done to us. And in the end, if we bomb the hell out of them, they win. Secondly, and this is another tactic that some of our presidential candidates have been talking about, we cannot close the door to the world. We cannot keep Muslims out of the United States, or I mean Syrian refugees. We cannot terrorize our own American Muslims in our country by isolating ourselves, by putting our heads in the sand, by trying to pretend that we do not have anything to do with the rest of the world. That's what they want. They win if we play that game. So, in my estimation, the only choice, and really this is the only choice in 2016, is one of collaboration, of multilateral, multi-party collaboration. And I do believe that our government is doing some things in that vein. They have, President Obama has established several international committees to investigate what, in fact, we can do to respond to ISIS. You should all feel somewhat protected by the fact that our government is doing what it can to protect us in many ways, right? The drone strikes, and I don't know how many of you have seen the new movie Eye in the Sky? It is unbelievable. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. The drone strikes actually are taking out very dangerous people. Targeted drone strikes could help. We have to respond in that way, but again, the peripheral damage, as Malou was referring to, of hitting civilians is very, very dangerous because it recruits more people who hate us. We also have, as Mark has done all his life, we have a lot of people in our country, in the security apparatus, that are trying to protect us. We go to the airport, we see how much protection they're trying to promote in terms of international travel. Anna is a journalist, and we are dependent upon the journalists to give us true and honest information so that we're not ignorant, that we're actually informed. But my own reaction to what happened to me and to my family, and what I think I have been spending my time since 1998 doing, is telling people that you too, I mean, we all need to work multiculturally, multilaterally. We need to work with American Muslims who are Americans, who can be as scared of what we're talking about here today as we are. They are a part of our country. Reach out to people that you may not know from other cultures. Get to know them, work with them, have town hall meetings in your little village to talk about some of these things about understanding each other. Invite people to dinner. If you've never had someone over to dinner from Syria, find someone and invite them for dinner. Or Iraq, or Afghanistan. These are countries that really, in 2016, we can be part of the world. We don't have to be separated, but we need to work at reaching out, getting to know people, talking to people, asking questions. I was in the panel yesterday on Islam, and basically the message of your panel was, don't be afraid to ask a question. If you know a Muslim American and you're really confused about all of this, ask them what they know about it. The more you know, the less you're going to be afraid. The more we're empowered by understanding each other and meeting people in the middle, halfway, the terrorists cannot win. They will not win. And so what I really think we have to do is be more Americans. We have to represent what our country is about. Our country is a multicultural experiment that is amazing. And so the message, I think, the threat of terrorism is that we will capitulate to this idea of fear, and we will not be who we are. We need to be who we are. We need to be Americans. We need to be open people that believe in multiculturalism, that get to know people from all different backgrounds, that are diverse. We need to defend that value of our culture. And I'd like to just end by quoting the president, who is trying in his own way to do a lot of these things. It's a nuanced approach to a very, very complicated situation. But he's reaching out to various cultures and trying to work together with them. So don't let our fear allow ISIS to win. As President Obama said, because long after the current messengers of hate have faded from the world's memory, alongside the brutal despots and the deranged madmen and the ruthless demagogues who litter history, the flag of the United States will still wave from small towns to national monuments, to distant outposts around our country. And what that flag will stand for is freedom from oppression, the right to liberty, respect for human dignity, and the pursuit of happiness for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you to all the panelists. I think that what I can contribute to this panel is just a perspective from the field of what the reemergence of ISIS looked like. Of course, ISIS has its roots in previous terrorist organizations throughout the world, but I can kind of explain the context in which ISIS reemerged in the Syrian conflict. I'd like to do that through kind of illustrating two different moments when I was reporting in the field. When I started reporting in 2012, there were a lot of opportunities. I was working in opposition-held Syria in the north, where I met technocrats, lawyers, upper-middle-class people trying to, imagine what a free Syria would look like, where they could have peace, justice, and rule of law. I witnessed civilians working to establish the first free Syrian post office. I witnessed lawyers who were trying to finally prosecute security officials who'd been involved in torture of their sons and daughters. I also witnessed the establishment of divorce courts and all sorts of civil infrastructure that you can't even imagine people would be thinking about while bombs are dropping from the sky. The other opportunity that I witnessed at the time was the defection of military officers from the Assad regime. There were brave service members of conscience who refused to attack their own people. And we saw those defections of professional military personnel coming very quickly to the opposition. However, the context at the time was of one that became an increasingly brutal civil war. The first stories that I covered while I was covering those civilian stories of imagining the free Syria, that was happening under the context of reigning bombardment by their own government. Many of the people in these towns that were initially liberated from the Assad regime weren't necessarily with the rebels at the beginning, but when their homes, mosques, and children's schools were bombed by their own government, they very quickly turned against a leader that certainly forfeited his legitimacy at that point. Also, a major story that I started to cover at the time was about torture. I've been working in the Middle East where the population is under 30, and many of these revolutions were started by my peers. The number of stories that I've reported on about torture of my peers inside Syria is unthinkable. So those were the kinds of stories that I was working on at the time. The last one I would mention was a story in a town called Al-Bab. This is now a town held by ISIS just outside of Aleppo. In that town, during that time, this was the scene of where all these technocrats were working around the clock. When I first started reporting there, in 1 week, 6 elementary schools were bombed by the government. Now we talk about, when we refer to Assad's bombardment of his own people, we often use the term indiscriminate bombing. But in fact, when 6 elementary schools are hit in a week, that is not indiscriminate bombing, that is targeting of civilian infrastructure. I was doing stories about bunker schools where people were still trying to continue and fight for their children's education and doing it in basements. In one such story, we saw a school that they'd moved the children into the basement. It was a 4-story school. A barrel bomb, which is an industrial barrel filled with TNT and shrapnel, dropped on that school, and it cut through 4 stories into the basement, killing the children in that classroom. So this is the context that these technocrats were fighting for at the beginning of the Syrian conflict in 2011 and 12. Also in that period, there were growing risks. The first would be Western and American involvement. There were mixed messages coming from the Obama administration during that period. On the one hand, he sided with the people who were fighting against an abusive government. He said Assad had forfeited his legitimacy when he fired on his own people, a brave message that resonated with people of conscience throughout the Arab world. At the same time, however, there were officials on that border promising weapons and support that never came. These mixed messages cost the United States quite a bit in terms of legitimacy among the rebels, and also cost the rebels legitimacy among more moderate rebels, legitimacy among the different groups that started to emerge. Again, when I started reporting, these military professionals were looking to become the future Syrian army. We look now in history books and we see that Hillary Clinton, in fact, based on the decision, if they were choosing to arm or not arm the rebels, she was saying in that moment, if we want a future Syrian army, these are the military professionals that we would want to arm. That didn't happen and cost the more moderate rebels quite a bit. Also in this time, there was a growing flow of foreign fighters. It was very easy for journalists at the time to communicate with these foreign fighters, not only because many of them were educated in the West, but also because at the time, they were not the risk that, we didn't have the same risks that we now face with ISIS in terms of the abduction and execution of our colleagues. At the time, these foreign fighters did not have much power in terms of the Syrian theater. The moderate rebels did have the wind in their sails, and it was in fact a small minority of foreign fighters with more radical ideologies entering. And because they were such a minority, they were respecting the majority Syrian opinion that wanted journalists there. So we were able to communicate with these fighters and understand their hopes and dreams and worldview, which ended up being very important in understanding ISIS to this day, but also important in understanding why young fighters' dreams have come true. They saw an ideology, a Middle East without the borders that had been assigned by imperial colonial powers. When I talked to them as early as 2012, they refused to acknowledge that border between Syria and Iraq. So you can imagine years later, as they've erased that border, why they would feel that their destiny is being fulfilled. So the other period I want to talk about is the summer of 2013. That was about a year later. At that point, aid for the more moderate rebels had never really shown up in a meaningful way. There also had never been a no-fly zone that would have protected civilians and prevented the proliferation of arms throughout the region. The next thing, some context in that period, there had also been peace talks in Geneva. In the 6 weeks that there were peace talks in Geneva, where you did have the government and representatives from the opposition, the government accelerated his aerial bombardments to a point that more people were killed in that 6 week of negotiations and peace talks than in the full first year of the conflict. So if you can understand the desperation felt in opposition-held communities at that point and the outrage against the government that was bombarding them, and of course the radicalization that comes with despair. At the time, the team that was profiting and capitalizing on that chaos and despair were these more moderate or radical groups. At that point, they had no shortage of funding the way the moderate rebels had at the time. They were the winning team with guerrillas who had fought all around the globe in insurgencies, so they were actually effective in their guerrilla tactics. So at the time, I quickly saw that summer foreign fighters that I met previous year who had always been radicals, starting to join up with moderate rebels who I'd known a year earlier as people who simply wanted to vote. So to see that radicalization and what can happen in a year when there is a vacuum of justice and proliferation of despair was quite stark. During that period of the summer, it was Ramadan when this group, ISIS, managed to use suicide bombers to take a very important symbolic airbase from Assad. Just weeks later, on the other side of the border in Iraq, they conducted an operation on Abu Ghraib in which 500 high-level terrorists were jailbroken from Abu Ghraib. At the time, this was reported on separately as something happening in Iraq and something happening in Syria, but in fact, it was the same organization. And when you see that happening during Ramadan, a period of added importance for an Islamist organization, you could really feel that the wind was in their sails. Then later that month, so that was July and August, then that month is when Assad used chemical weapons against his own people. So while the United States was debating military action based on the violation of that red line, the stakes had never been higher for Syrian civilians. During that period, that same period when the West was talking about this escalation of military involvement, we saw this startup ISIS take over the whole northern countryside. This was lost in the news because, of course, the use of chemical weapons on civilians is, unthinkable. But this was incredibly important in terms of this group creating an Al-Qaeda stand, but what would become an Islamic State, or the Islamic State, on both sides of the Iraqi and Syrian border. It wasn't, I bring up that this was the summer of 2013 because it wasn't until the summer of 2014 when ISIS took Mosul that we saw media attention to ISIS and also hard political action that we can debate if it's effective or not to this day, but this is really when it revved up. So it was a year that there was policy from the United States totally divorced from the reality on the ground. The Islamic State existed virtually an entire year on both sides of that border, and whether we acknowledged it or not. So I want to end to return to the panel about the threat. I want to talk a little bit about Islamophobia here in the United States. and return to the young men that I met on that border early on who were foreign fighters. When I spoke with them, as I mentioned, they were educated in the West. And while I certainly disagreed with their conclusions of what should be done about the injustices, as a progressive and someone who values human rights and would hope that the United States would follow its own laws in combat, they were very aware of American crimes overseas in Muslim countries, whether it was drone strikes in Pakistan and Yemen or abuses by the US military in Iraq. They could state these based on American documents and the same kind of sources that journalists use. So they were very knowledgeable about these abuses overseas, but they also had felt enormous alienation in their homes in the West. So this Islamophobia, combined with very real abuses by the United States overseas, is what recruited these initial founders of ISIS and some of the young fighters that fight and die for the Islamic State to this day. I bring that up because the election cycle has really diluted the threat of domestic terror here in the United States. We know from our national security professionals and professionals on domestic terrorism about the real threat here at home. When Homeland Security and the FBI look at the threat of domestic terrorism, it is not from the Muslim community in America. The vast majority of these terrorist plots come from white supremacist groups and groups that have nothing to do with Islam. So this rhetoric that we see in the media and from these politicians really threatens to politicize a process that is important. Our domestic security is incredibly important, and we need to allow our government official, or our national security officials domestically to do their jobs based on intelligence that's rooted in reality, not in the sensationalism of the media or politicians. So I would end on a few things that I'm seeing that have worked. The first is returning to Islamophobia. There's a security professional who worked in Chicago, and coming from the East Coast and coming from New York, he knew that he didn't want to make the same mistakes of domestic surveillance and bugging of Muslim Americans spying on American citizens that we saw in New York. When he worked for the city of Chicago, he headed up their terrorist unit where they worked with the federal government to provide grants and resources and reach out to the Muslim community to work with them. Most Muslim Americans, my colleague said, many Muslims recoil at the reality of ISIS. I would say most do. And so allowing those moderates within the community to protect their own children from this radicalization was a constructive counterterrorism strategy that has worked in Chicago. The second thing is a point that my colleague brought up yesterday on our panel on Islam about the recruitment not happening in mosques, the targeting that we've seen, the vandalism of mosques in America, not only is racist and counter and frightening to our community members of the Islamic faith, but also not based in reality in terms of where these threats lie. What we do know about how ISIS recruits is best compared to sexual predators in terms of recruitment online and the strategies they use to alienate young people from their communities. Security professionals want to use strategy based in these things instead of targeting communities and racially profiling. So I guess as much as I've seen what ISIS has done in the stakes of the expansion of ISIS and really the hell that they've rained on the Muslims of Syria and Iraq, I guess to close, just to again look at the context of the threat and the best practices that we can allow to proliferate here in America is the point that I would like to make.
Let me make a couple of comments before I allow the members of the panel to add a couple of points. As all of the panelists have brought up, that the political season has brought out some recommendations on violence or bomb. There was a different expletive. I remember it wasn't bomb the hell out of them, but that's all right. that you can certainly eliminate, you can degrade their ability to fundraise, you can degrade ISIS's ability to sell oil across the Turkish border, you can degrade their ability probably to do some amount of recruitment, but you cannot bomb away the ideology. It will not go away. We killed Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the head of ISIS, the heir to this ideology, but it did not go away. These disenfranchised Sunnis, these humiliated Sunnis, that ideology, we need to do something else beyond military solutions. And these sorts of ideologies often grow up in power vacuums, and it's really important to understand where the instability in Iraq and Syria came from. And the United States has to take some credit for that. I was talking to markets, at least you can get agreement across the aisle. I mean, the Democrats believe if we hadn't toppled Saddam Hussein, and George W. Bush hadn't done that, this wouldn't have happened. And the Republicans will follow that if Obama hadn't withdrawn so early, then this never would have happened. But the idea that instability in Iraq. But the al-Maliki government, I've had Iraqis tell me that the al-Maliki government was more brutal, flamed sectarian tensions much more than Saddam Hussein did, and their inability, that security space that was given to them was not taken advantage of by Shia Iraqis, and those Sunni Iraqis that we allied with in the Anbar Awakening in 2006 were never incorporated and became many of those Ba'athist army officers and other government officials that were de-Ba'athified became the groundswell of ISIS inside Iraq. In Syria, the Arab Spring, this young 15 boys in the city of Dara wrote the Arab Spring slogan on the wall, the people must topple the regime. Those 15 boys disappeared for 2 weeks, returned with their fingernails torn out. And these were all boys under 16. This is how a Mukhabarat state, the Assad regime, Bashir al-Assad and his father Hafez al-Assad. Hafez al-Assad, we believe, killed some 20,000 of his own people in the city of Hama. This is not good governance. I mean, and what started as a peaceful, as Anna talked about, these number of people who were educated elite, who really were a cry for good governance and democracy, was immediately met with incredible violence from the regime. When you have that sort of thing happening across a border, it creates a power vacuum in which the most radical ideas can emerge. And again, I'm not sure a military response, the old idea of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, in the case of Iraq and Syria, it's very difficult. We've got Erdogan in Turkey is supposed to be our friend, who's bombing Yazidi Kurds and the YPG, who are our best fighters against ISIS. Putin's on the ground fighting against the rebels we're supporting. The Kurdish groups, the Barzani and Talabani Kurds in Iraq are assisting the YPG, but they can't get along. I mean, so as much as you think there might be some sort of military solution, it's very, very difficult to figure out who to support and who not to support. And I think, as Anna brought up, there might have been a window. There might have been a very narrow window before it descended into chaos, and call it maybe an electoral promise or war weariness of Iraq and Afghanistan or European inability to do so. That window was probably missed with a chance to maybe have a difference that probably could not be made now.
A few things I'd like to add. There's some themes that we hear often in the media, and actually we hear some from political figures that is totally inaccurate. They don't hate us because who we are. They hate us because where we are. The whole attack by bin Laden was to make it painful for us to get us out of the Middle East. He didn't want us in the land of the holy temples. And Osama bin Laden wouldn't even recognize the Saud government. He would call it the Arabian Peninsula. He would not even call it Saudi Arabia because he did not want to give deference to the Saud family who was ruling Saudi Arabia. Just recently this week, I think yesterday, there could be something that was very significant that happened where in Riyadh, a colonel in the security services for Saudi Arabia was assassinated, and this Daesh cult took credit. So if they're extending their brand of violence into Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, it's going to mobilize the Saudi Arabian government to take more action. The other thing that I'd like to say is, while many people consider this a religious war, I don't think it's a religious war at all. I think they're fighting for land, and I don't think it's about theology. When someone is recruited into, whether it was Al-Qaeda, and I've done studies and I've talked to people who were with the IRA or with loyalist groups. I've been to France doing studies of violent extremism. I've been to the UK. I've been down to Southeast Asia. And what I've seen is there's one common theme that gets someone to commit violent extremism, and that's identity. And they're all looking for identity. And so in areas, whether it's in Iraq or Syria or Yemen or any of these places, you have generally a disaffected population who is looking for something. And that's, Malou had mentioned France. What you have in there is an isolated, disaffected population that is searching for an identity. That's what happened in Leeds and Bradford with the 7/7 bombers in the UK. You had people who were UK citizens from Pakistani origin who did not assimilate well with Pakistan because they weren't Pakistanis, nor in Britain because they weren't from the UK. So people seek identities, and that's what happens. And they morph from different groups. In Yemen, a group will be with Al-Qaeda 1 month, and then they'll shift over to be with a tribe another month. They're looking for survival. The third point that I'd like to make is the solution to these problems is in the Middle East and with the very Muslims that sometimes we vilify. It's a very small segment of their population that is violent, and the violence is committed overwhelmingly against other Muslims, not the Westerners and not the U.S. And we have to shift from tactics to strategies. We can't bomb our way out of this war. We helped create this group, this Daesh cult that's operating now, and we're going to need some help to eliminate it. And it may be a generation away. And we're going to have to be accountable for our actions. We discussed that they dressed them in orange jumpsuits. Well, that's because we dressed them in orange jumpsuits. When they've taken hostages in Syria, they've only waterboarded the U.S. and UK hostages, no one else, because we waterboarded them. And of course, we've yet to hold people accountable for torture. And so you take a disaffected population who went to violent extremism because they've been humiliated and disaffected for a lot of years, and then we further humiliate them and degrade them. And the number one recruiting tool for years for Al-Qaeda was Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. And we're currently still trying to close Guantanamo Bay, which is a symbol of injustice, of oppression, and of torture. And I know I worked with General Leonard, the Marine general, who was the first general down there, and at the time he said it took an Army captain to get someone to Guantanamo Bay, and it takes the President of the United States to get someone out of Guantanamo Bay, and now the President is having trouble getting people away from Guantanamo Bay. So in the U.S., we have to look at strategies, and what we do is we use a lot of application of kinetic energy. So we look at matching their tactics with our own tactics that are similar. And it's until we come up with a good strategy, long-term strategy that will eliminate their ability to recruit, their ability to finance, and their ability to operate, we're going to be in this for a long time. Now the good news is this Daesh cult is struggling right now. They've been so ruthless to the Muslim communities that there's a lot of backlash. They're having trouble paying their soldiers. They're running out of funding, yet they're still able to draw more and more recruits. As Joanne said, they are incredible marketers, and they're able to manipulate and draw the disaffected populations who are searching for that identity to the battle. And it's much different there, and the concern, and we have some geographic benefits. I don't believe that the Daesh is an existential threat to the United States. There will be isolated incidents, but they're not looking to invade the U.S. And Malou had told you some of the facts and figures about you're more apt to be struck by lightning than attacked by a terrorist here, particularly one of those. Now, that's not saying there's not going to be isolated incidents and there's not going to be something happen, but that's part of life. When we get on the highway, we take certain risks. When we make our choices for what we eat or drink, we take certain risks. So there's certain risks to living. They have to be manageable risks. The other thing that I just like to add before I turn it over to the other panelists is, if you actually study the incidents in the United States where we've been able to interdict a possible terrorist attack or terrorist cell, most of those cases you could link back to a Muslim who reported that information. So the rhetoric in the news is this is a religious war and they hate us, and they don't. They don't. It's not about us. It's about them trying to live. Thank you.
Just to echo and expand upon what's been said, I would agree that certainly ISIS is not an existential threat to the United States. What we saw during the Cold War, certainly the looming threat of nuclear annihilation with two rival superpowers with vast arsenals of nuclear weapons poised to strike at a moment's notice, that's an existential threat. And I think this sort of dovetails with what we had mentioned earlier in the fact that there has to be an acceptable level of risk, some level of risk that we have to realize and accept. There will be more Santa Bernardinos. There will be more attacks. There will be more Brussels. That doesn't mean that we should hyperventilate when these attacks do occur. It means that we have to have more sober analysis of the situation and not lash out and talk about torture and carpet bombing. I know this is something that Mark said before, but it needs to be emphasized that torture doesn't work. The overwhelming evidence that shows that it does not work. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Executive Summary says that torture does not work, what they call enhanced interrogation does not work. So we really need to analyze our policies and to understand that the rhetoric, it might sound, it might make us feel better, but it doesn't really get at the root of the problem. I also want to mention, the notion that Anne had mentioned about the window of opportunity to strike at ISIS. Perhaps it existed, but I'm of the firm belief that it's damned if we do, damned if we don't. After the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the intervention in Libya, the drone strikes in Pakistan, the intervention in Yemen, I think it's safe to say that there's a great deal of resistance to U.S. involvement, and because we didn't involve ourselves, we're chastised. And if we go in and there's many civilian casualties, we're chastised. And I think at some point we have to realize that it's like a vortex. You put your hand in and it keeps sucking you in, sucking you in, sucking you in. So at what point do we pull out? At what point do we stop? We intervened in Iraq and knocked over Saddam Hussein, and we saw an expansion of Iranian influence across the region. We saw the de-Ba'athification that led to the rise of the Sunni insurgency. So at what point do we say we have to stop? Or at what point do we say, like with each increased event, that means that we have to redouble our efforts? Do we redouble our efforts, or do we begin pulling out? That's a very difficult question. I also noticed that with the current violence in the Middle East, it's very split along the Arab Cold War lines. The Arab Cold War was between the more the revolutionary, militaristic Arab socialist regimes of Egypt under Nasser, the Ba'athists in Iraq and Syria, the military regime in Yemen. That was one side of the Arab Cold War. The other side of the Arab Cold War was the conservative, reactionary, monarchical regimes, such as our freedom-loving friends in Saudi Arabia, the monarch in Jordan. We also saw this to a lesser extent, though, with Iran under the Shah. And so we see these dividing lines of these conservative monarchical regimes that were supported by the United States and the more revolutionary Arab socialist regimes. And many of those Arab socialist regimes are the ones that are falling. It's the ones that are backed by the United States and by the West that have, for many various reasons, have survived. I think we also need to speak about, and this hasn't really been touched on too much, but the level of Sunni involvement in supporting the insurgency in Syria. I'm sure my co-panelists can expand on this a bit more, but we saw a great deal of Saudi and Qatari support for early remnants of the insurgency. There was this notion of a Shia crescent, given the support from Iran, from Hezbollah, and for obviously the Alawite regime under Assad. And so there is some element also of a Sunni Shia split there as well. But I'll leave that to my co-panelists. Thank you.
I think it would be good to get to questions. People are starting to leave, but the only thing I wanted to add is, the idea of creating these multicultural partnerships with the Sunni Arab nations, with Turkey, with the European nations, to stop the genocide, because, the genocide, Secretary Kerry just came out and said the genocide against the Yazidis and the Christians and the Shiite Muslims is phenomenal. So we all need to somehow stop the flow of foreign fighters, and I think that's something I'd like to hear, if there's anything happening in that level.
I guess the only point that I would want to make is maybe about U.S. involvement in Syria. And there's an argument to be made that it wasn't our fight. And it's true, historically the United States hasn't had a relationship with Syria. But the other issue is when this first started, there were demands for a no-fly zone. We were very hesitant to get involved because, of course, that is military action if we were to involve ourselves with a no-fly zone. But from there, when we didn't protect civilians with a no-fly zone, that is when armed opposition started asking for weapons. And it was very logical. They were saying, if you won't protect us from this raining terror from the sky, let us defend ourselves. And now there are very good questions that should be asked about whether or not we should continue to train and equip different groups around the Middle East when so often those weapons destabilize the entire region or are eventually used against us. So I think that, just to clarify, some of the questions about military involvement in Syria. But one thing that I would say is, Obama had the humility when he entered the administration to be very cognizant of the mistakes that we've made in the region, not only with the invasion of Iraq in terms of President Bush, but also historically, the abuses that we've committed throughout the region. However, this humility kind of led to a reluctance to be involved, or partial policies here and there that maybe didn't create a comprehensive strategy for the region. And we've seen that without American leadership, we've also seen a disintegration of some of the partnerships that we had. So I guess without talking about involving the U.S. military in future wars or anything, I guess I would like to see politicians, as they enter office, with a comprehensive strategy about how we're going to have relations with the Middle East. I'm not only talking in terms of security cooperation, because so often the security cooperation that we invest in, that security is used against its own people. I'd love to see a comprehensive strategy that involves much more the State Department, and that allows the moderates, which are the vast majority of the region, to be empowered and partnered with them for a more constructive future.
I would love to open it up to questions from the audience. We have 2 microphones set here, and I'd like you to line up, and we'll try to alternate back and forth besides microphones. And again, reiterate that please try to keep to questions and not statements. Write a book and get on a panel next year and come back and make a statement. Yes, ma'am, over here.
Yeah, quick question. Multiple panelists brought up that we need increased intelligence, and especially European countries are lacking intelligence. Can you expand on it a little bit, what you have in mind? Does it mean the government needs to spy more on people? Will we have a police state, or how do you envision it? Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for asking that question. I think with intelligence, it's certainly not about creating a greater police state. Certainly not. And so I'm happy you asked that question because it needs to be clarified. Mainly what I was speaking about was the need for sharing intelligence amongst the European countries. You know, despite the fact that we have NATO, the level of intelligence sharing within the European countries is actually, it would be quite shocking to many people to know the paucity of intelligence that's being shared. I think now what we're seeing is a redoubling of efforts within NATO and within the European countries to begin sharing intelligence, but it's not the level of integration that you would think. It's actually quite bad. And also, in that respect, you see that there's various levels of the competency of those intelligence organizations. But certainly, I'm not talking about, you know, like the stop and frisk policies that we had in New York or anything like that. Nothing like that.
Yeah, I'll also add what Malou had said. It's really the sharing of intelligence. We've had our own challenges and struggles with that within the United States. And as a major collector of intelligence, it's even that more difficult for us to share it with foreigners. And so, you know, we're very parochial in the information that we receive, and we're going to need, and you can imagine how each European country is the same. So I know Interpol, which does more communication sharing than the television shows depict, is looking at are there better methods and measures to share intelligence information amongst the law enforcement community. The security services vary from country to country with different relationships in each one. So there's not a unified intelligence database about what happens. And these threats can emerge very quickly. And cells can establish very quickly. So it's rather challenging, and it's what Europe is going through, what we went through after 9/11.
Yes, sir, over here.
So one of the things that I think is really interesting is how the interventionist policy of the United States has largely failed in the Middle East. Not just the United States, like Western policy from the Sykes-Picot Agreement after World War I up to the Iraq War. So one of the things that I'm interested in, what lessons do you think future U.S. policymakers can learn from the rise of ISIS, both in terms of how we can rebuild the Middle East, assuming that ISIS will be defeated, and also to prevent the rise of a similar terrorist organization in the future?
Yeah, I don't think we can build the Middle East. I think the Middle East needs to rebuild itself. You know, Churchill tried to draw lines over there. We're trying to create something over there the way that we think it ought to run, and their people think they need to be self-governed in the way they run. So I don't think it's really for us to solve.
I would agree with that, and oh yeah, please, I would agree with that. I will concur wholeheartedly. I think oftentimes we espouse the idea of self-determination and the principles of democracy and liberty and human rights. But sadly, we've seen in the course of our history during the Cold War and especially the War on Terror of sponsoring coups, overthrowing governments, sponsoring insurgencies that undermine the very values of self-determination that we seek to promote. That's very problematic, of course. And even the history in Syria, I mean, in the 40s and in the 50s, early 50s, the CIA in cahoots with the British, we overthrew a few governments in the Middle East, including in Syria, including in Baghdad, including in Tehran. So that definitely undermined the idea of self-determination.
The idea that we intervened in Iraq and we occupied and it's a mess. We intervened in Libya and didn't occupy and it's a mess. We neither intervened nor occupied Syria and it's a mess. So, I mean, choose your poison. The idea is maybe we can't sit back as the big guy and do nothing, but military intervention is probably not the solution. Yes, sir.
Hi, this question is for Malou. You mentioned how ISIS murders Alawis, Shias, and Sufis, and many people think that it's just Shia and Sunni. So could you please go into explaining the Sufis and their role within ISIS and their oppression as well? Thank you.
As I mentioned in my brief comments, you know, what we see within ISIS, and I think you see largely in the more militant brand of militant Islam and jihadist Islam, is a strain of Wahhabist or Salafist identity, a strain within Islam. And it's not a vision of mainstream Islam, and this is mainly from the Sunni branch of Islam that came up in the Arabian Peninsula, specifically in Saudi Arabia. And it's a very, very, very austere interpretation of Islam. Again, this is the notion of a pan-national Islamic identity. It's not necessarily Islam as a religion per se, but more of a political ideology. It seeks to establish its own rule of law. It seeks to establish what would be considered basically a 7th century legal code. This is why you see a lot of the barbarity, a lot of the sort of more gruesome images that we've seen under ISIS-controlled territory. And it is from the Sunni branch. That's not to say that there aren't reprehensible things happening in the Shia branch as well, but I think mainly what you see is that it's a strain of conservative ideology within Islam, and it's the Salafist branch. Hopefully that answered.
Most of you touched upon the idea of and the trend of politicizing the threat of terrorism within the West and in the U.S. So I'm curious to hear which players and maybe countries are behind this and what their intentions and objectives are in doing so.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah. Sorry. Different parties' objective in politicizing the threats of terrorism in terms of the psychological impacts and within the country.
Oh, like the political players right now in our election cycle?
Yeah, or institutions, the Department of Defense.
Okay, of course. Well, I raised that issue, so I guess I'll respond. Well, in terms of this election cycle, I mean, I kind of brought this up before, and I think one of my it's been said a few times about having some context in this threat, and we heard, after terrorist attacks, using these tragedies to target an already vulnerable, marginalized group in America, again, isn't representative of the threat, and also a really cheap attack on a vulnerable population. So that's why I raised it before, and I guess just to kind of reiterate that, I work in the media, and of course, we're drawn to sensational stories and these kind of cheap stories that are almost capitalized on popular fear. So while I take responsibility for being part of an industry that exacerbates some of this misrepresentation of the threat, I guess I just want to reiterate that to everyone, and also, and what's really at stake when the media and the and political candidates kind of use this cheap, low-hanging fruit, that's the sensationalism, and what's at stake is, of course, repeating mistakes that we've made in the past against minority or new immigrant populations in the U.S., and then also perhaps, fighting for resources or tactics that our own law enforcement, would advise against.
He's gone. I agree with your comment, and I think the one thing that would be nice is if we got some actual real analysis or plan of what these different candidates are actually going to do if they got into office, because right now it's just superficial reaction to a media situation, and they're not even addressing all the nuances and the depth of what we're confronted with. And it would be really interesting to get some factual information about what they would actually do.
Just expanding that a bit, I want to speak very quickly because I see that there are other questions. But we also have to recognize that just as there are political factions in the United States, there are political factions in the countries that are allied with us. Some would argue that Turkey has more of an incentive to target, the Kurdish minorities and Kurdish groups than go after ISIS. So, you see even our allies, they're being pushed and pulled in various directions, and they have their own interests in this region, and they may not always align with our own.
As it's been addressed, in the United States, Islamophobia has been heightened, especially when political candidates are almost endorsing this behavior. So how does the United States as a country, as well as United States individual citizens, work to combat the effects of Islamophobia and lessen the tension between those of that particular faith and United States citizens, or ones that are United States citizens?
Just to start with, let me just say that the comments that I'm hearing now from some of these candidates are irresponsible. They're totally irresponsible, and they could fuel actual violence against us. I mean, there are actual candidates who are actually running on a war crime platform. And so that is troubling, and it's troubling because when I analyze it, they are either uninformed, which is a frightening scenario. They've been misinformed, which is another frightening scenario, or they're well informed and have intentionally made a decision to advocate for war crimes. So I don't see a good alternative to each of those. Now the solution is a well-informed voter, a well-informed public, to get beyond what I'm hearing in the news cycle, which is just a recapitulation of what they're saying. I mean, when the 24-hour news services just continue to go over because it's sensational news, and it really takes an informed public to really counter this.
I would totally agree that it takes American people to get themselves informed, and that, as I said before, reaching out to other Americans who have information about Islam and get the truth about Islam, for example. There's so much misinformation out there, so that we can avoid these Islamophobia developments in each part of the world, in the country. But also vote. I mean, think about voting for think about what we're voting for, and if we're not going to hear it as sensible foreign policy from some of these candidates, then it would be irresponsible to be Americans voting for them.
Just add one thing. I think also, especially given what happened in the wake of the Iraq War, we also need journalists. Thank you, Anna, for being here. But we need journalists who will challenge overinflated threat assessments. I think that's a huge, huge problem as well.
We have just a little more time over here, sir.
So the general consensus seems to be that the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the deposition of Saddam Hussein was kind of where this road started that led us to ISIS. Having said that, do any of you believe that the only system of government that works in this region are authoritarian regimes? And if not, can democracy, as we understand it in the United States, work as a system of government in the Middle East?
Just a bit of, I guess, conjecture, but I don't think the sample size is large enough. It was highlighted by one of my co-panelists that, a lot of the borders were imposed, post-Ottoman Empire. So the sample size and the amount of data that we have is maybe the last 70, 80, 90 years. That may not be the most accurate reflection of the people in its region and what they believe can be a reflection of the governments that they want. Simply because they were led under many authoritarian regimes, that doesn't necessarily mean that those are the best forms of government for them. It could be more tribalist. It could be a nomadic hunter-gatherer, depending on parts of the region that you go to. It also depends. I mean, Levant is very different than the Arabian Peninsula. That's also very different than, say, the Hindu Kush. That's also very different than Morocco. But I understand the sentiment behind your question, because that's something I've certainly heard before, is that, given the level of bloodshed and chaos and disaster in the region, isn't it better with a strong armed dictator? But what we see also, and this is a vast amount of the polling data, the survey data that we've seen coming out of the Middle East and Persian Gulf, is that many Muslims across the Middle East, they like the idea of democracy. Democracy mainly being, the will of the people should be the basis of government. And they want to have democracy as they see it. And there's again, I talk about the push and pull. They like democracy, but they also like Sharia law. So there's a difference there, and they need to work out those struggles for themselves. And I think to the extent that they see the United States and the West breathing down their neck, it's very difficult for them to reconcile those discrepancies.
We're getting close. Yes, sir, over here.
Yeah, I mean, given that we're at a public university, I wanted to bring up this new book, Engineers of Jihad, which was just published by Princeton University Press, which highlights something that I think a lot of people recognize, which is a curious connection between jihadists and engineers. When was the last time you heard of a terrorist who had a degree in English literature? The reason I bring it up is sort of tongue-in-cheek, but also to say that part of this is also, we spoke about people who received education abroad. They didn't receive an education. They received a vocational training or a technical training and some technical skill. So part of, I wonder what you think about part of addressing this systemic problem is actually changing attitudes towards education, which include for us laying more emphasis on humanities. I'm a humanities educator, so that's why my...
Very cool. Thank you for asking that question. I have read about that a lot. In fact, the early nucleus of Al Qaeda, especially Ayman al-Zawahiri, the second in command under Bin Laden, the one who even just recently told ISIS to chill out because they were so radical. He was trained as an engineer and as a doctor, and I think you find a lot of engineers and doctors in the early, sort of the rankings of Al Qaeda. The theory that I've heard is that in engineering, and I'm sorry to all the engineers in the room, but you see things in very black and white terms and very mechanical terms, and it's easy to sort of dehumanize a lot of things, versus in the humanities or the social sciences where you have a deep appreciation for life and the dignity of the individual. And so I think that's probably one theory that we've seen in terms of why is it that someone could be so again, dehumanize the enemy so easily.
Yeah, Mark, wanted to follow up on something you said I thought was very important. You mentioned quickly funding of ISIS. This seems a really important thing that we could look at. And if you know anything about versus the carpet bombing and the troops on the ground, who is funding ISIS? Like, follow the money. Where is it coming from? Who's supplying the weapons, the ammunition? Only so many countries make that kind of stuff. If your answer is oil around the funding, then what's the reason that we aren't going after that infrastructure? And who's buying that oil?
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, having investigated terrorists for a lot of years, what you do is you follow the money, because you need to finance your operations, and sometimes I think it would be costly. You need to rent safe houses and buy explosives and weapons, and so they're doing it a lot of ways. They're doing it by taxation. They tax people. They do it by kidnap and ransom, for ransoms. And that's why the UN now has sanctions against paying ransoms, because it further proliferates the kidnapping situation. And I guess about a month or 6 weeks ago, some country bombed a bank holding a lot of the Daesh cash. And so their revenues are depleted. And I think that, and as I said, I think they're on the decline, actually. I think they're struggling right now. And I'm hopeful that we'll make some strides. Now, there's not going to be stability over there, but I think the Daesh cult as we know it might be on the decline in the next number of years.
I would add to that another shameless plug for my book, Perilous Partners, The Benefits and Pitfalls of America's Alliances with Authoritarian Regimes. In the book, my co-author, Ted Galen Carpenter, and I actually detail some of this. And it's with respect to ISIS, but also with Al-Qaeda, what you saw in the lead up to 9/11. You saw what was called the Golden Chain. It was a sort of a network of financiers, of private financiers all throughout the Persian Gulf and mainly in Saudi Arabia, of private individuals who would give tithe and give private donations, and some of that money would find its way into madrasas or into very conservative NGOs and things of that matter, and some of that money ended up in the coffers of Al-Qaeda. And this was up until 2009, 2012. So even though the United States has worked in cooperation with a lot of the governments in the Middle East to try and crack down on that financing, it's extremely difficult. It's the equivalent of giving money in church. How do you crack down on that? How do you know exactly where that is, especially when you have a great deal of plausible deniability?
2 more questions. Yes, sir.
All right, thanks. I'm trying to find out, what does the Muslim student population think of all this? I haven't seen, well, this is loud. I haven't seen many of them march around, or, I'm not among them, but it's not addressed to you guys, of course, but I don't know if there are any in here, but that's a good question, I think. And back in the 60s, 70s, more of the students were more active, that kind of jazz. You know all that stuff. But what are they going to do? what are they doing? How are they behaving? How are they reacting to this sort of stuff in the Middle East? Yes, it's been going on for years. We all know the history, but sometimes it's sort of a reflective self-responsibility to certain groups of people because other groups of people are looking for a response from these groups of people because they need some kind of initiation, some kind of motivation. And it's important that if I was, I mean, student population of a certain body, representative body, and that's a topic that concerns me. Question is, sir, sorry.
I can't speak on behalf of all Muslim students, but I would imagine, it's the equivalent of, saying, for instance, my Caucasian co-panelists, if every time there was a Caucasian murderer, they had to say, well, not all Caucasians are like this. I mean, it's that frustrating.
No, I understand.
You can't speak on behalf of all of the people in your entire community, and I think that's the frustrating part that at least my Muslim friends are encountering.
Right.
Yeah, I want to respond to that too. I had several panels on Islamophobia in Washington I've attended, where American Muslims are saying, they feel as horrified as we do, but why would they stand up and say something about ISIS when, it's not their responsibility? And it's like when some Christian in this country does some horrible thing, do we all get up and protest? No. So the point is we all have to protest. We all have to do that.
I'm sorry, I put the gentleman behind when I left. But my query was, yes, you're correct. I understand what you're saying, but we all have a responsibility. So I just wanted to find out what the student population, because they're young people and they are assuming new roles in the world and all the rest of it. And it's important because you mentioned yourself, ma'am, that about inviting people into the home and all that stuff. You had a discussion, you mentioned that earlier, and so I want to know really what's the crux? Why? I know what you're saying, but what really is? Can you explain that more? My query here.
Muslim students here. Let's move on to the last question, please.
So we've talked a lot about political or military influence in these countries and how that's affected our output, our relationship. But has economic influence really come up much? Because it seems like there's places or there's ISIS affiliates popping up in South the Philippines and northern northern Africa, and we haven't really been in those places militaristically. So once we pull out, are economic influences really still going to affect us? Do you believe?
Well, there's disaffected populations around the world, and the groups are not just jihadi groups. There are Maoist groups, the New People's Army in the Philippines, as well as Abu Sayyaf. So anytime you have a group of disaffected, disenchantized people who are looking for an identity, they are vulnerable for something. And many people look at it through the Western lens, like they're on a team or things like that. Well, it's very fluid. And they're shifting. They're looking for survival. Some of them are looking for revenge. Some of them are looking for a voice. But most of them are looking for an identity. And ISIS, ISIL, Daesh, Al Qaeda, Jamaat Islamiyah, these groups offer them something that they cannot get where they're currently at.
Will you please join me in thanking this incredible panel who stayed over time to answer questions and be with all of you. And again, thank you all for attending today.